students, welcome to Tarunayas. Today we will be discussing editorial discussion from the newspaper The Hindu of 12th of October 2022. So let's start with first editorial of the day. So I have taken this editorial from The Hindu titled Building Resilient Mineral Supply Chain. You can relate this topic with your General Studies paper 2, that is General Studies paper 1, that is Economic Geography, and General Studies paper 3, that is Indian Economy and Mobilization of Resources. So we are going to discuss today resilience supply chain. Now what do we mean by resilient supply chain? Supply chain basically, it means the transportation and distribution of any product or the produce from factories or any economic establishment, right? So for any nation to grow, the resilient supply chain is of utmost importance, considering what happened during the COVID-19, when the majority of the supply chain were concentrated in China and the rest of the world felt aloof and felt alienated with regard to the supply of the products of essential commodities. Now, this article specifically focuses on the energy security. Now, for any nation, the energy security is important. And what amounts to energy security? The first point of building energy security is the raw material. Or you can say the primary source of energy. Now the raw material or the primary source of energy, it could be anything. For now, India is highly dependent upon coal, that is fossil fuels. So basically fossil fuels could be the primary source. Or since the world due to climate change has been transiting towards the renewable energy, so renewable energy sources will be our newer sources or newer generation sources. So these constitute one point, right? In energy security of any nation, the primary source of energy is important. The second is the supply of the energy. Right? Supply of energy. It could be in the form of coal, like we discussed here. It could be fossil fuels, non-fossil fuels, or renewable energy sources. So supply of the energy, its distribution. Supply and distribution, they will constitute one point, right? So the third point is the logistics. So the first point of energy security is the source material from which we derive energy. It could be renewable energy source or it could be non-renewable energy source. The second is the supply of that energy, whether it is hydroelectricity, it is coal, or it is renewable energy source. The continuous the continuous or uninterrupted supply of energy is important. The third point is the logistics. Now logistics does not simply mean about the transportation or the traffic of anything. Logistic, it is multifold. It has various dimensions. It is distribution also, it is packaging, it is management of the supply chain, etc., etc. So therefore logistics also becomes important when it comes to the energy security, right? So the writer points towards the mineral energy security. Now we are going to understand the mineral supply chain. And the suggestion that the writer suggests in order to build a resilient mineral supply chain to fulfill the upcoming energy demand of the country, considering the pace of the digitalization and the high-tech technology that the country is going to observe in the near future. So if you look at the mineral supply chain, now these minerals are specifically, they are the critical minerals. If I take the example of electric vehicle, so the supply of the critical mineral or critical elements like lithium, cobalt, nickel and rare earth metal becomes of utmost importance. Even if I speak of the semiconductor that recently India has been has been venturing into this new sector of economy, that is semiconductor, and other high-tech technology like 5G, digitalization, optical fibers, etc., etc. So the requirement of the critical mineral is going to increase. Therefore, we have to build a resilient mineral supply chain for the future of the country. Now let's focus on that why do we require the resilient supply chain for Atmanirbharta, for developing the self-reliance. There are concerns over the pricing oil and gas crisis. If we consider the recent Ukraine-Russia crisis, then the oil price are increasing, right, because of the war. So in order to reduce the imported inflationary pressure, in order to sustain through the fragility of the global supply chain. Now what is this imported inflationary pressure? When we import a commodity which is very expensive, for example oil, when we are importing oil at high price, that means we are basically importing inflation. So in order to reduce the imported inflationary pressure, we have to build a resilient supply chain in order to overcome the volatility in the oil and gas market, and in order to reduce the risk to the macroeconomic dimension of growth of the country, in order to secure access. Now if we consider the example of India, then India does not have vast resource of rare earth metal, lithium. Therefore we need to rely on other countries, and in order to do that we have to secure access to the minerals. For example, when it comes to lithium, India has recently secured an agreement with the ABC country, that is Argentina, Bolivia and Chile. So these countries are going to supply lithium to India. In case of the uranium, which is deficient in India, we consider agreement with Australia, Kazakhstan, etc. So therefore we have to secure access to such resources which are of critical importance to India's growth and energy security, right? So we have discussed that why do we need to build a resilient supply chain, and these are the critical minerals that India is going to require in the future: lithium, cobalt, nickel and rare earth metal, etc. Now let's move on to the challenges that are associated with building the resilient supply chain. The first challenge is the concentration of the minerals in geopolitically sensitive regions. For example, West Asia. We've got lithium reserves. in the ABC countries. Already Argentina, etc. Argentina is suffering from, it's going through high inflation. So these are geopolitically sensitive regions. And considering the impact that the China's economy and the policy and the tactics is going to have on the geopolitical scenario, that India faces a tough competition when it comes to securing the access to such resources. Now, a portion of such concentration is geostrategic. It is controlled by the geostrategic competitors like China. Now, if we take the example of China, then it has considerable influence on the cobalt reserves in Democratic Republic of Congo. So basically, India has to overcome this geopolitical and geostrategic challenges. The future mine production is often tied up with the offtake agreements, right? Now what happens? The geostrategic countries, they sign pre-agreement with the country to obtain such resources from such reserves. For example, China controls the cobalt mining in Democratic Republic of Congo. So what India needs to do, the writer suggests few points that how India can build a supply chain, resilient supply chain, and how India can secure such access to such mineral resources. Now in the year 2019, India had established KABIL, the Khanij Videsh India Limited, in the year 2019. This was amalgamation of three important CPSUs, the Central Public Undertakings, so as to build a bigger establishment or a bigger organization which will work in favor of India, or which will work for India's interest in the foreign countries, so as to obtain strategic access to such resources. This was one move that was taken by the government of India in order to secure such access, to such critical resources. Now the writer suggests that in order to have such access, India must know its domestic requirement, that what are the minerals that India requires, and what is the level of the requirement, and what are the domestic establishment, whether private or public, involved in such resilient chain. And therefore we need to have the listing of the domestic mineral requirement. So domestic requirement has to be listed down. The prospects of the domestic requirement, it needs to be framed. Writer suggests that a task force can be constituted for such purpose, which will look into the matters such as power, the heavy industry, new and renewable energy, and science and technology. Requirement of such ministries can be taken into consideration. Also, the targets for deployment and indigenous manufacturing across clean energy application. So we have to understand what is the domestic requirement when it comes to the critical elements or the critical minerals which are to be outsourced or which are to be taken from the foreign countries, and what are the current production in the country with respect to such critical resources or other resources which are going to be complementary to such resources. So domestic requirement and domestic requirement profiling needs to be done. So this is the first suggestion by the writer. Now let's move on to the other suggestion. Writer suggests that the government of India needs to coordinate with the domestic industry. Like, it has to be a parallel coordination. They have to go parallel, and they have to develop an intelligence unit so as to understand, so as to track the global supply side development, and also it needs to develop the perspective on the mineral supply, the sector specific usage. For example, if an industry is involved in chip making, it has to list down the requirement of the critical resources, and it has to list down it has to also give account of their access to the domestic resources, so their production capacities, etc. Writer also suggests that the private companies need to be encouraged so as to secure the mineral for its own usage, whether it is domestic, or it is to be outsourced. Right. So writer says that the private companies can also get into agreement with the sovereign country, with the other sovereign country, for its mineral requirement. Now let us look at the other suggestions by the writer. The writer talks about the role of KABIL, that is Khanij Videsh India Limited, that what KABIL can do when it comes to securing access to such critical resources. The first, it talks about the preemptive offtake agreement with the global mineral suppliers to secure future production. That means the KABIL can enter into agreement with other entities which are the global suppliers of such mineral resources. It can sign the sale agreement with the domestic industry also. And the writer talks about what government can do in this regard, that is the role of the government. First, the joint investment with the geostrategic partners. The role of Indian government would be to enter into an agreement and to invest jointly with the geostrategic partners. And it can also leverage the government to government partnership to mitigate such investment, to mitigate risk which is associated with such investment. It can also establish the resilient clean energy supply chain. For example, recently Japan, India and Australia, they had built an association called Supply Chain supply chain resilience, right? So such agreements can be done by the government of India, or in fact this supply chain resilience by the government of India, Japan and Australia can be leveraged in order to access the critical resources in the geostrategic or geopolitical areas or regions. Now let's talk about the support technology. Now let's look at the other suggestions by the writer. It talks about that how the domestic production of the support technology. Now it is not necessary that our technology utilizes or relies completely on the critical resources. The side technologies are also needed. So the mineral requirement of such support technologies can be procured from the domestic manufacturing or domestic production. For example, the sodium ion batteries. Sodium ion batteries. You can prepare lithium ion batteries, these ACC batteries from the prelims perspective, right? And this sodium and nickel cobalt. What is the difference between these 3-4 types of batteries, or what is the advantage of the lithium ion battery over the sodium ion batteries or nickel cobalt batteries? So this is from the prelims perspective, you can prepare. Then it also needs to incentivize investments in the technology. That means the government of India has to invest into such technologies. It can co-develop such technologies. The writer suggests that such technologies can be co-developed with the geostrategic partners. The writer also suggests developing a policy. That means the India needs to develop its critical mineral policy, the national critical mineral policy, so as to have a wider and a more coherent and a clear perspective when it comes to securing access to such resources, when it comes to increasing or boosting the domestic requirement on production, and also building the framework and listing down the domestic requirement in order to fulfill the demand of the energy security. Now, the writer says that India must act immediately to secure or to have energy security, which boosts its energy growth in the future, in future scenarios. So therefore, we are done with this topic today. So I hope you have understood this topic and you can relate this topic with other dimensions given in your syllabus. So with this, thank you very much.